I'd like to introduce the Professor of Finance from London Business School. In the Great Place to Work world, you don't often get to actually make an introduction like that, the Professor of Finance, because, oftentimes the hardest people that when we're actually going into organizations to talk to them about this great place to work, and there's a few people who are kind of, really passionate about it and they're kind of, into it, but then there's always the people over in the corner, and they're generally from finance. And they're sort of, their arms are folded and they're sort of sitting back or lying back in their chairs, and they're the ones that those questions come from. Well, yeah, it's fine, but what about the numbers? And they're all about the numbers. And thankfully, the next presentation is all about the numbers. So this the wonderful thing here is Alex actually asked a question. And the question was whether or not strong business performance that makes a workforce feel really more motivated and in turn more productive. Is that how it works? Or is it the other way around? Is it that strong metrics around employee retention, around motivation, satisfaction, and engagement, that's what actually leads to the stronger business results? And right now, Alex is going to come here and share his findings. Alex.
Okay, this is it. Great. Okay, well, thank you so much. It's really nice to be here. Thank you for the Great Place to Work Institute and to A&L Goodybody for the invitation. So I'd like to ask a simple but fundamental question. Why do businesses exist? What is the purpose of a business? Is it to earn profits? Or is it to serve a purpose? Is it for shareholders? Or is it for society? Customers, the environment, or as we're focusing upon today, for workers. Now, the conventional view is exclusively to earn profits, because legally, a company is owned by its shareholders. And indeed, this leading economist, Milton Friedman, said the social responsibility of business is to increase profit. Businesses serve society by just making as much money as possible. And that's not as narrow-minded as it sounds, because to earn profits, a company is forced to care about society. It has to make high-quality products, or customers will stop buying. It can't pollute the environment, or its brand will be hurt. And it has to treat its workers well, or they'll leave. So under that view, and that is indeed the view that most finance people, as John alluded to, have had for many, many decades, just make as much money as possible, and that will force you to care about your workers. Because you'll think, well, should I pay my workers a bit more, a bit less? You're going to think about the effect it has on your profits. So under this view, you just head to the land of profit, and you're going to get all of those other decisions right. But there is a new view. Let's consider whether that view actually works in practice. That view works in theory, right? We can calculate, we can look at the financial impact of every decision that affects workers, but in practice, we might not be able to do that. So let's take Marks & Spencer, the UK high street store. Many of you have heard of this if you've gone to England. Now, former chairman Simon Marks, he had a policy where all top managers had to walk around the shop floor to see firsthand how customers and workers were being treated. And one day, back in the 1930s, on one of his own visits, he sees a shop assistant faint. And he's concerned and he wants to find out why. And it turns out her husband's unemployed. So she is not eating so that her family can. So the very next week, Simon launches a policy to provide nutritious meals to all of his staff at nominal prices. Why? Well, Milton Friedman and any finance academic would say, do a calculation, right? If I provide nutritious meals, this many workers are not going to faint, and so I'm going to make this much more money. But there's obviously no way you can do that calculation. For a finance person, only do it if you can calculate the benefit. But you cannot calculate the effect of feeding your workers well on health and on profits. Instead, you do it just because it's the right thing to do. And indeed, this was Simon's thinking. It was simple. I'll provide nutritious meals, even if it costs me a bit, because I care about my workers and I want them to eat well. And because of this thinking, because Marks and Spencer does not reduce everything to a financial calculation, it has an excellent reputation for quality, and that in turn leads to profit. And so that's the second view, which is often called corporate social responsibility. Now, you might see this as a bit tree-huggy and out of touch, but it's actually not too different from the first view. It agrees that profit is good, but profit is only the byproduct. It's not the end goal. Instead, businesses exist to serve a purpose, to make products that transform customers' lives for the better, to preserve the environment for future generations, and to provide employees with a healthy and enriching workplace. And you do this even if you can't calculate the bottom line impact of doing so. And if you do this, the profits will come naturally. Let's take another example. I think we've got a representative from Merck in the room. So let's take George Merck. He is the former president of Merck Pharmaceuticals. His philosophy wasn't, how can I make as much money as possible selling drugs? It was, how can I use science to save people's lives? So this is a photo of Ann Miller. This is a photo of penicillin. Ann Miller will come shortly. So poor Anne is not hearing me. So penicillin. This was a drug back in the 1940s. It was still an extremely new drug, right? It hadn't been tried outside the lab before. It was just too expensive, right? But Merck took a punt, and he decided to make penicillin, be the first company to make penicillin for the first time, even though it was so expensive, you could not mass produce it. So this was only for the lab, not for a corporation. But Merck made this. Now this, hopefully, is Ann Miller. So Ann Miller is a 33-year-old woman. She's living in New Haven, Connecticut. She's married to Ogden Miller, who's the Yale University athletics director. But on March the 14th, 1942, Ann lies dying in a hospital bed. She's stricken with streptococcal septicemia, which she's captured after suffering a miscarriage. Her fever has hit 104 to 106 degrees Fahrenheit for 11 straight days. Everything the doctors have tried has failed. Until penicillin. Thanks to Merck, Anne becomes the first American ever to be treated with penicillin, and it saves her life. The very next day, her temperature is down to normal. She goes into making a complete recovery. She lives until 90 years old, and she has 3 sons. And as George Merck said, we try never to forget that medicine is for the people. It is not for the profits. The profits follow, and if we have remembered that, they have never failed to appear. So, just serve a purpose, and the profits will follow. That's a nice idea if it were true, but where is the evidence? Well, as John was saying, that's what I wanted to get set out to gather, is evidence to show whether social responsibility, and here social responsibility to your workers, does this pay off in terms of better financial performance? Now, this was something that many people had looked at before me, and these people were not from finance, they were more from strategy and management, where we look typically at employees. And for many years, they'd found this positive correlation. Companies that are good to their workers or to society or the environment typically do better. But then there's a problem here. And John alluded to the problem, is how do we interpret these results? Is it that treating workers well leads to better performance? Or is the causality in the other direction? Is it only companies that are doing well to begin with that can afford to spend money on treating their workers well, or on, say, cutting their carbon emissions? And this is critical, because if I'm going to stand here and try and tell you that you should be investing in your workers, I need to show you that the causality is in the first direction. And so this is like the goal of academic research. So often people think, well, academics sit in their ivory tower, they might not have useful evidence or useful insights for business practice. But some of these things can be quite relevant. So why? Well, I just came up with 2 studies. You didn't need to be an academic to know about Merck and Marks and Spencer's history. But how do you know that I didn't just handpick those 2 studies? Maybe I'm someone who supports social responsibility. I just chose those 2 examples because they worked. And it could be that if somebody else had a different agenda, they could choose the example of maybe, say, Amazon, which is known to have poor HR practices and yet does really well. So when we read the newspapers or we talk to consultants, we typically will hear some great examples of case studies, and obviously those people are much closer to businesses than academics or professors are. But our relative advantage is that while we're not as close to one individual business, is we can study hundreds of businesses at different points in time and look at the general relationship between these variables. And the second thing that we can try and do is try to get towards causality. So all of these studies up here, they'd look at the effect of responsibility on profit. Then there's a problem. Does responsibility lead to profit, or does profit lead to responsibility? So this is why I came to this debate as a finance person. So typically finance people, they don't care about these things. They see it as fluffy and tree-huggy. But the nice thing about being from a finance perspective was that I was able to use finance techniques to get towards causality. And I don't want to get too much into terms of technical detail this late in the evening, but just to give you a little bit of an overview for what I'm doing. So let's assume that treating your workers well is useless. It has no effect on profits. It's just the result rather than the cause of good performance. It's only companies that happen to be doing well to begin with that can invest in their people. So let's consider that. And let's consider a company that today is profitable, is doing well in October 2015. If happy workers are purely the effect rather than the cause of good profits, because the profits are already high today, its stock price will already be high today. So if I look at future stock returns, the future stock returns of that company won't be any higher, because if it's already profitable today, the starting point is already high today, so the change in the stock price should be zero. But if instead I find that social responsibility or ethical treatment of employees today leads to better returns tomorrow, then it's pretty likely that it's ethical treatment of workers that leads to better performance rather than the other way around. So that's just the broad overview of what I'm doing. Okay, so I've told you how I'm going to measure performance. I'm going to look at future stock returns. But how do I measure corporate social responsibility? It's very difficult. It's an intangible measure. This is what I use. I take this data from the Great Place to Work Institute. So I'm going to look at employee well-being. Now, that's not the only dimension of social responsibility, but it's one that I chose because this data is particularly thorough. So this was something that I used, and I took the 100 Best Companies to Work For in America, which was published now every year in Fortune magazine. So what are the advantages of this measure? Well, number one is that it was available from 1984 in the US. So it covers a long time period, which is very important, because if I only had this measure for a couple of years, maybe I was just got 2 lucky years where it happened to be that those companies did well. Looking at 26 years from 1984 to 2009, covering recessions and booms and covering different industries, I could try to make sure that this result is not confined to a particular time period. Regardless of whether you're in a boom or a recession, I wanted to see, does treating your workers well pay off? And I wanted to cover many industries, because many people in this audience are from different industries. So it was insufficient for me just to look at Marks & Spencer and Merck. Maybe this only works in retail and pharmaceuticals. That's going to be useless to those of you who work for a law firm, for example. So I wanted to cover different industries. So why is this measure so thorough and so respected? It's not the only measure that I could have chosen. There are other measures out there. But the other measures that I see, they tend to be relatively superficial. So you could measure, for example, employee diversity by looking at whether there is a woman or an ethnic minority on the board of directors. But that's really superficial. It's easy to manipulate. You could have a company that does not care at all about diversity, but they just put a token woman or a token ethnic minority on the board just to tick the box. Instead, this study is particularly thorough. So many of you will know of this already, but just to give an overview for those who don't, this looks at not only quantitative factors, like pay and benefits, but it also looks at qualitative factors such as trust in management, pride in your jobs, and camaraderie with your colleagues. So 2/3 of the score comes from 57 questions that the Institute gives to 250 workers randomly selected at all levels, and their questionnaires are returned directly to the Great Place to Work Institute. Management doesn't see this. This is completely anonymous. And the questions are not just, are you happy? They are questions on specific areas: credibility, respect, fairness, and pride and camaraderie. And these questions were come up with after a lot of surveys and beta testing with managers and workers and HR consultants and the like. And as I mentioned, this was published initially in 1984 and then 1993. Then from 1998 onwards, it's been published every year in Fortune magazine. Okay, so what I wanted to look at is, what is the effect of being a great place to work on your future stock returns? But how do I know whether good stock returns are because you're a great place to work? It could just be your industry happened to perform well. So if I look at the last slide, they mentioned Google is a great place to work, but its stock returns could just be because tech has happened to do well over the last few years. Nothing to do with it being a good company. So what I need to do is I need to control for the industry every company is in. I want to compare Google to Oracle and other tech firms to make sure it's employee well-being and not some other factor which is driving returns. I also want to control for the size of the company, their recent performance, their profits, their dividends, and so many other characteristics, and isolate the effect of employee well-being alone. So it took me 4 years to complete the study, to verify the robustness of my results and to rule out all of these alternative explanations. What did I find? What's the big bottom line? I find that the best companies to work in America, they beat their peers by 2 to 3% per year over a 26-year period. I think this is a striking finding. If you're a fund manager and you beat the market by 1% per year for 5 years, you're considered a superstar. This is the returns to treating your workers well. Just something seemingly so small as just treating your workers ethically, this can add substantially to your bottom line. This compounded over 26 years, that could be probably like 60 to 90% when you're aggregating this up. So simply put, companies that treat their workers better do better. So that's what I'm going to present to you in terms of my actual results. There's far more on the paper, but I'm not going to get to that. Instead, what I want to do is to talk about the implications of these results for real-life managers and for investors, so the people who actually work in businesses. So what is the first implication? So the first implication is it means that treating your workers well does pay off. You might think, isn't that obvious? Do we need a study to tell us this, right? Doesn't it make just common sense that companies should do better if their workers are happier? But it's not obvious, because treating your workers well is costly. Let's take Costco, for example, the US supermarket. Now, Costco pays its workers $20 per hour. That's nearly double the national average of $11. And it gives 90% of its workers healthcare. That's expensive. And indeed, an exasperated equity analyst, an investor, said Costco's management is focused on employees to the detriment of shareholders. Why would I want to buy a stock like that? It's paying its workers double. It's just wasting money. That's the view of a lot of these finance guys, is this is just a waste of money to treat your workers well. Indeed, the traditional view is that the firm is just a zero-sum game. It's a fixed pie. Any dollar, any euro you give to your workers is just taken away from shareholders. And so under that view, what makes a great manager? It's someone who can pay their workers as little as possible and work them as hard as possible. And if you think of, say, what are great managers outside of corporations, I don't know rugby so much, but if you think of, say, football, why are Sir Alex Ferguson or Jose Mourinho seem to be great managers? Right, they give their players the hairdryer treatment, they work them really hard, they make sure that when they're out on the pitch, they are just sweating every inch of their body and every drop of blood for the team. You don't want workers to be happy under this view because they're just slacking off. This is why we see those types of managers as being the most efficient. And indeed, I saw this myself. So before my current life of poverty as a professor, I used to have a proper job. I used to work as an investment banker for Morgan Stanley in London. So here's a photo of my oak-panelled corner office. So as you can see, I was a junior analyst. As you can see also from the microwavable ready meals that I had in the bottom left-hand corner. And one day in the office, the vice president catches me laughing. And he says, "Alex, do not laugh when you're in the office." And I asked, "Why not?" And he says, "Because if you're too happy, the managing director will think that I'm not a good manager because I'm not working you hard enough." And so this is quite sad. So this is the view, is that to be a great manager, particularly in those types of organizations, you want your workers to be unhappy, otherwise you're showing them otherwise you're just letting them slack off. But instead, my results show that treating your workers ethically does pay off in the bottom line. As Costco's former CFO Richard Galanti said, from day one, we've run the business with the philosophy that if we pay better than average, provide a salary people can live on, have a positive environment and good benefits, we'll be able to hire better people, they'll stay longer, and they'll be more efficient. And how is this achieved? I'm actually going to skip some of the slides later on in my talk because I wanted to do something ad hoc just based on what the minister said. So the minister talked about 3 channels, which are retention, recruitment, and motivation. Now, let's think about retention and recruitment back in the 20th century firm. So this is a manufacturing firm. There you actually did not care about being a great place to work. You didn't care about treating your workers well because you didn't care if they left. So back in those organizations, let's think of a factory where you're making cars. The workers did relatively simple, unskilled tasks. So if they left, you could just replace them with somebody else. You were relatively nonchalant to recruitment and retention. These were not important challenges. But now, in many organizations, law is certainly one of them, right? People are indeed the greatest asset because human capital, rather than physical capital like machines, is what drives the value of a company. If one of the law partners of this firm was to leave, she would take her whole client base with her, and so this is why retention and recruitment are particularly important. And why can't you just get retention and recruitment with money, right? Why do you look at these other things like credibility and respect? Well, tons of research and psychological evidence has shown that money is important, but only up to a point. Once your basic physical needs are met, then people look for other things from their jobs like self-improvement, self-actualization, self-esteem. The other thing he mentioned instead of retention recruitment was motivation. Was motivation a challenge back in the 20th century firm? Yes, it was, but it was an easy challenge to address. How did you address the challenge of motivation? You just paid people for output. That was easy in a manufacturing firm because output was easy to measure. In a factory, you count the number of widgets the person produces, you pay them $1 per widget. So even if they were really unhappy and didn't like working for the firm, they still had to work hard. That was the only way they're going to get paid. So motivation was very easy back then. But nowadays, motivation is very difficult. You cannot pay for output because in most jobs, the output is not measurable. It's not quantifiable. For example, say in a law firm, it might be the extent to which you're mentoring your subordinates or supporting other departments. It's not just the amount of revenue you bring in based on your clients. And also, Julian mentioned this idea of discretionary effort. So a lot of things that you do are things which are not specified in the contract. Back, if you're working on a factory, your contract will say exactly what you're supposed to produce. But here there's many things that are not contractable. And even if your working hours are 9 to 5, it may well be that you choose to stay until 6:30. What's going to encourage you to do that? If you're truly aligned with the organization's purpose, you're internalizing the organization's goals as your own. In those circumstances, that is when the discretionary effort is going to be done. You're going to be working hard, even if it's not specified in the contract. So this is why I think the world has changed. The world's changed from the factories of the early 20th century, because recruitment and retention is particularly important. Human capital is the greatest asset in many of these firms. And number two, motivation cannot just be done with a carrot and stick. Right? Carrots work when tasks are simple and you want to hire donkeys. Right? If you want to hire people with skills and intelligence, they are not people that you can just use carrots and sticks for and mechanistic methods. It has to come from within. It has to be intrinsic. Okay. So that's the implications for managers. And just to look at Costco once again, Thanksgiving is the biggest public holiday in America. Like, everybody's free to go shopping, but not at Costco. Because Costco is closed on Thanksgiving, and Costco is closed on every public holiday, even though doing so sacrifices so much money. Why does it close? Just because Costco's management believe its workers should be spending these holidays with their families. And that's not at the expense of profit, because Costco's profits have topped $2 billion for the last 2 years. Okay, I'm going to skip a few slides during the talk because I know we're running late. I want to make sure that the people at the end have enough time to go through their material as well. So instead I want to shift gears and move from talking about what managers should do based on these findings to talking about what investors should do. Okay, so maybe you think that you're not a professional investor and that your job is not to work for a mutual fund, but all of us are investors in that we have pension funds and we choose stocks ourselves. And this is really important because as investors, we have the power to put our money in companies that reflect what we would like to see in the world. Now, the conventional view is that if you treat workers well, this is at the expense of returns, but I've said that there is no sacrifice. Investing in companies that treat their workers well, by doing this, you're not only supporting good work practices, but you're also making money yourself. Indeed, based on the findings of the study, there is a mutual fund, the Parnassus Workplace Fund in America, which invests only in companies with healthy workplaces. Over the 10 years since their launch, they've beaten the market by 4 percentage points per year. But also, the results have implications for how we choose to pick stocks. So it's very tempting when we choose stocks to look at things like price-earnings ratios and dividends and earnings. Quantitative tangible measures, they're easy to look at on Yahoo Finance. But some of the most important dimensions of a company's value, its corporate culture, its customer loyalty, its business sustainability, that's simply not captured in short-term numbers. So we should move beyond the short-term and the quantitative, things that finance people obsess over, and move towards the long-term and the qualitative. Because often finance people think, well, we shouldn't care about workers because this is just something we cannot measure, we cannot quantify it. But that's not true. Even though something cannot be quantified, it doesn't mean that it can't be measured. So there's many good measures out there, such as the Great Place to Work measure, and this applies not only to measures of employee satisfaction, but measures of other dimensions of social responsibility. True Cost and Sustainalytics, they measure environmental responsibility, and Asset For and Calvert have a whole range of responsibility measures. So put your hand up in the audience if you've heard of all 4 of these measures. There's not a single hand up in this room. And when I gave this at my TEDx talk, in an audience of 500 people, nobody had heard of this. And that's precisely the point, is that people haven't heard of those measures, even though they're so thorough, just because the market is so focused on quantitative numbers. They are blind to these things which are essential, and they're important just because they're not as quantitative. But that is great news for us, because this means that if we as investors look at these measures when we choose stocks, this gives us a comparative advantage, because no one else is looking at this information. If we choose things like that, that's stuff that everybody else is looking at. So we want to choose stuff that other people are not looking at, which is this information. And indeed, I find that perhaps because the market is so short-termist, perhaps because the market is so focused on the numbers, perhaps because the market, like the analysts in Business Week, wrongly thinks that great places to work are tree-huggy, I find that it takes the market 4 to 5 years before it recognises the benefits of employee well-being. So you could buy great places to work stock 3 years too late, and you're still going to make money. So think long-term value, not short-term numbers. And separately, we shouldn't dump stocks at the first sign of trouble, because if you invest in your workers, it costs money today. The benefits take many, many years to appear, as that animation was supposed to show. So if we dump a stock because it's missed this quarter's earnings target, then we pressure management to focus on the short term and not to invest in your workers, because that's something with only a long-term payoff. So this is a guy you might know, Paul Pullman. He's the CEO of Unilever. And when he joined, he stopped reporting quarterly earnings because he said a focus on quarterly earnings is going to make Unilever short-termist and not invest in people and not invest in the environment. And this is why Unilever is one of the leading forces for sustainability today, for example, by designing shampoos that use less water. And one of Unilever's own investors is Alliance Trust. They're one of the UK's oldest investment firms. They've been around since 1888. And some families which held Alliance Trust stock back in 1888 have passed those shares through generations, and they remain with the same family today. And that's why they can take a long-term perspective. And this is not at the expense of returns. They've increased their dividend every year since 1967. And if you had £100 in Alliance Trust stock back in 1888, that would be worth £18.5 million today. If this were to scale, that green bar would be through the roof of this building. So this is the benefits of a long-term perspective, because it's in our very nature to be short-term. You can see what happens when a country gets knocked out of the Rugby World Cup despite being the host nation. They will call for the head of the manager. And this is, again, what we do not just in a sporting context, but whenever a company misses its earnings target, we want to call for somebody's head, or we want to praise somebody for beating the earnings target. If we do this, companies are not going to be investing in the workers. It's a multi-year investment, as Julian's example of his firm showed. And so what are the ways to do this? I have many slides, but again, I promised to try and get us back on schedule. I'm just going to go for one of them. It's to look at how we pay CEOs. Because even if a chief executive believes in everything that I've said, even if she's enlightened and she knows that she should be investing in her workers, she's not going to do this if she's paid according to short-term performance and if this is what investors are evaluating her. So there's a huge debate on CEO pay at the moment, and lots of this pay is about the level of pay. So do you pay your CEO 1 million euros or 2 million euros? Should it be 100 times the median worker or 200 times? But I think this is focusing on the wrong dimension. So I'm not here at all to defend high pay or not. All I'm saying is that's not the only dimension that matters. Rather than just looking at the level of pay, what's important is the horizon of pay. Are you paying the manager based on how the firm does in the next quarter or the next 5 years? So I think one of the great improvements that we can make to pay schemes is to extend the horizon of pay by locking up the stock for maybe 5 years' time. That forces them to take a 5-year perspective. I know that it's much more attractive for a politician to say, I'm going to reduce pay so that's no higher than 10 times the average worker. That sounds great, but I think the thing which is going to have a much greater effect on how managers actually treat their workers is by saying, well, you're going to be paid according to 5-year performance rather than 3-month performance. And just as evidence for the effect of this, what I look at with some co-authors is what happens in years in which the chief executive has a lot of equity coming due. So chief executives have stock and options. When they come due, they typically sell them to diversify. What happens? So what I find is that in years in which you'll have a lot of equity coming due, you significantly cut investment. They're cutting research and development, they're cutting advertising, they're cutting capital expenditure, they're doing all of these things to meet the earnings target. These are very powerful, very dangerous effects of short-term compensation. It leads clearly to short-term behaviour. I don't have time to go through the graph, but that is something which just backs it up. So let me just summarise before I hand over to the next person. I started off by asking this question. Why do businesses exist? To earn profit or to serve a purpose? For shareholders or for society? Customers, the environment, or for workers? What is the answer? The answer is yes. But how can you answer yes to a multiple choice question? Because it's not multiple choice. It's not either or. It's not zero sum. It's both and. Businesses exist to serve society and to serve their workers. And by doing so, and only by doing so, will they generate profits in the long run. To reach the land of profit, follow the road of purpose. Thank you very much for your attention.